Okay, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wassalamu ala Sayyid al-Anbiya wal Mursaleen. Allahumma alimna ma yanfa'una wa anfa'na bima tu'allimuna wa zidna bi fadlika ilman wa ta'liman innaka ala kulli shay'in qadir. So, if we can imagine, discussion today is about the Mursal Hadith, right? Inshallah, those of you who had time, listen to that section from the Sharh al-Tirmidhi of Ibn Rajab that I shared with you. Inshallah ta'ala, that's great if you did. If you didn't, not the end of the world. Excuse me. Um, the discussion here is pretty important. So let's imagine how information is transferred. Okay. So let's imagine, for example, there is a newspaper. There is something called CNN. Okay, everyone's familiar with CNN. Yeah, famous news, popular news channel in America, CNN. Okay, let's imagine that that's the only source of information. Okay, if you want to find out something, you go on CNN. Okay, and they tell you this happened and that happened. Okay, now suddenly somebody comes along, tells you, these people make mistakes, right? Like they make a lot of mistakes. They don't just make mistakes; they like lie, right? They lie or they misinform or they change information. So now your approach to CNN is very different to us before. Before you were like, well, why would I not trust it? Okay. I don't need CNN to tell me its source. I don't need CNN to tell me its source. I can just trust it. Okay. Now you have a different approach, which is, oh, CNN makes mistakes, they lie, they change reality, they cut things out, etc. So now I'm only going to believe CNN if they tell me their source. So I'm going to say, CNN, what is your source? They don't give me the source, I'm not going to accept that. I'm not going to accept it. Okay. So that is the discussion of the Mursal Hadith. Okay. That is the discussion of the Mursal Hadith. So what were the two scenarios? Scenario number one was CNN, you trusted it. Why would it lie? It's, I trust it. I don't know it to say things that are wrong. I don't know it to make lies to me. So I just trust it. I don't know what its sources are. It just says this happened and that happened and this person said this and this person said that. But I don't know what the source is. I just trusted it. Right? Until I started to find mistakes and somebody showed me there was actually contradictory information that shows that these people are A, incorrect, or B, lying. Now I need to ask the source. Okay? So if you can imagine, you are Imam Malik, or forget you are not Imam Malik, you are Muhammad ibn Aslam, Abdullah ibn Maslama, okay? Al-Qa'nabi, you're one of Imam Malik's key narrators, okay? You go and ask Imam Malik a question, said, did the Prophet say this? He said, yes. Okay. So why are you going to ask him for a source? Right? Why would you ask him for a source? What do you think, guys? Why would I ask Imam Malik to give me a source?
Mm, maybe so you can check if it's correct.
So you don't trust Imam Malik.
I would say Sheikh to test if his memory is good or
But
yeah.
but the, but the upshot is you traveled from Spain all the way to Medina to go and ask somebody that you don't trust.
No, but I think to double check something is better than just to trust someone because it's something big like the Deen.
Okay, so you should be more careful. Okay, fine. But do you have to be more careful? Like, isn't it
I would
enough that
say
Imam Malik said it?
Well,
I would
he's fallible, so it could possibly be that he did something wrong while being reliable.
Okay, so he's not lying. He's not lying, but he could make mistakes. So basically, so you trust him morally. I don't think he's gonna lie, but I do think he could make mistakes. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. So here's a question. Abu Huraira quotes a hadith. Could Abu Huraira make a mistake?
Um, Possibly, yes.
Okay. So now I'm
I
going to
think
ask his source. Can you say the Prophet ﷺ told me? And I'm still not convinced because Abu Huraira could still make a mistake. Does that make sense? So when you
okay.
asked Imam Malik for his source, that didn't raise it from dhann to yaqeen. It didn't, you didn't, you trust Imam Malik, that's fine. But you said, well, I want to be surer. So then it's still on the level of dhann. Okay. But so why would you question Imam Malik if you trust Imam Malik?
If I'm not mistaken, even people they would trust, they would just check their like memory, and if they could narrate things they should have in memory, or at least written down somewhere to now, yeah, recite it correctly.
Okay. So now let's imagine that you have no source at all. Okay. You came from the middle of nowhere. Okay. You know about Islam. You came to Imam Malik, who is you've heard that Imam Malik is the greatest scholar ever. He says the Prophet ﷺ says something. Okay. Before you check, before you check, or if you don't have the means to check, do you have to apply what he told you or not?
I think so.
Okay. So therefore it's a hujjah, correct? It's a proof. So what you were saying before, Farhan and other people, was it's nice to check, you should be more careful, right? But at the end of the day, if Imam Malik is labeled as this huge scholar, even if he doesn't quote his sources, it still gives you dhann, and you still feel obliged to follow the teachings that he's told you. And he said the Prophet ﷺ said X, therefore you have to do X. Is that right or is that wrong?
Right.
Okay, so this is the argument of the people who say the Mursal Hadith is a proof, right? Is that by default you trust me, whether you know my sources or don't know my sources. That's irrelevant. That's just extra. That's just being pedantic. That's just being you want to check even more, right? That's But at the end of the day, right? At the end of the day, it is a proof. Just like when Sayyidina Umar, who is it, Abu Musa al-Ashari, told him a hadith, and then he said, you better get somebody else to confirm what you said, or I'm going to have you beaten. Okay? So it wasn't that Sayyidina Umar doesn't trust him. It was for other reasons. He wants people to be more careful. That's all. But it is a hujjah. Okay? So the default is that a mursal hadith is a hujjah. It is a proof, right? The Sahaba would narrate hadiths from other Sahaba without quoting the source. They wouldn't say, Ibn Abbas wouldn't say, I heard so-and-so say this. Sometimes they did, right? But a lot of times they didn't. Most of Ibn Abbas's hadiths are mursal. He narrates from other Sahaba. But he doesn't necessarily quote his source, and that's fine. So where is the issue? The issue is the dhuhur al-khata. Dhuhur al-khata. It is that CNN is not actually a reliable source. So now I need to know its source. Okay? Or that my source is reliable, but the source of my source is not reliable. And again, how did I know that? From dhuhur al-khata. So in principle, what I'm trying to say in principle is there would be no difference. There's no necessity for us to have a thing called isnad, right? And this is important when talking to Christians, right? When we talk to Christians, we say, look, we have isnad and you don't have isnad and da 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 da. The default is you don't need isnad. Because the default is, hey, you're a religious person, You're quoting religious people. You're not changing the deen of Sayyidina Isa. The default is you should trust each other. That's the default. Okay? That is the default. So when we come along and ask them, hey, where's your chain transmission? That's not really that fair because it's not actually the case that you actually have to have that. Okay? It is not the case that you are only confident unless you have isnad. It's not how things work. Right? That's not really the case. Right? When you read a book and it says something without a reference, you don't just reject it. You're reading the book, you trust the book. The book seems to make sense, you know. People make lots of claims without proofs all the time, and by default, you trust them if they're trustworthy, right? So the default is you do not need isnad, and the default is if this person is trustworthy, it's fine. And so this is the idea of accepting the mursal hadith, and specifically what's called mursal al-thiqa, right? You are trustworthy. I don't know what your source is, but I trust you. Therefore, I trust your sources, and it's all fine. That is the default, right? And that is the majority opinion. Okay? That is the majority opinion. Okay? Now we come to the world of hadith science, where the muhaddithin, like Ash-Shu'ba ibn Hajjaj and others, they come along and they find mistakes. Now comes the stage of liars, people with weird sectarian views. So now there are liars. There are people making up things. Okay? So, and the content of this hadith, for example, is very strange and sounds odd. So, so if the content is strange, I'm now surprised. I've never heard anything like that. Well, what is your source? Right? What is your source? Okay. Or people are making mistakes. You've made mistakes in the past, so now tell me your source. Okay. So, as an accident, as a result of the circumstances, the muhaddithin came up with this thing called asanid and rijal, etc., as an accident, as a reaction to a problem. But if the problem did not exist, then we wouldn't need to do that, right? And let's go back to Medina, right? In Medina, did we have lots of sectarian differences? Shia, Khawarij, did that exist in Medina?
No.
No. Okay. So if you could imagine, like, if you could imagine life in Medina continuing without foreign influence for like 400 years, it's very conservative. People just do what other people do, and they just copy in the self same way. Then the default is, whatever the deen is known to be in Medina is the deen, right? And so this is also the whole idea about Amal Ahmadina, right? The whole concept of Amal Ahmadina, which is a slightly different discussion, but it's a similar kind of thing, okay? And so I don't need to check narrators and check sources and all these things because everything just staying normal. Everything that is being quoted, we're familiar with. There aren't mistakes that are happening. There's nobody trying to lie. There's no change anything. But you have two things. One, firaq, weird, right? Weird aqidah issues which are happening all over the place, but not so much in Medina. Okay. And genuine mistakes. People are making mistakes, right? People are actually making mistakes. So now, as an accident of finding mistakes, now that you've actually found mistakes, that people narrate the hadith in one way or another way, so, oh, there's actually a problem here. Now I need to start asking the question, oh, what is my chain of transmission? Does that make sense? So often we sold this idea that if you didn't have a chain of transmission, there would be no dhann. You wouldn't be confident. It's not really the case. And how do I know that? Because everything is narrated without a chain of transmission, right? Like everything reaches you. Like all the books that you don't have a chain transmission for those books. And if you did, it doesn't really mean much. It's like a name. It's like, it doesn't really mean anything. Like most of history comes to you without a proper chain transmission. So if you came along and said, I don't believe anything that doesn't fulfill the conditions of Bukhari Muslim, you're going to have a serious problem because you wouldn't really believe much at all, right? And you're going to have, that's kind of like ultra ultra critical, which is not really safe. But rather what happens is the muhaddithin, they have a very, very strict standard, and that strict standard came about because of the existence of sectarianism and the existence of mistakes that they observed in hadith narration. Okay, so they're being very, very strict, and that's not necessarily the case. So the default is a mursal hadith. This is why we find people like Abu Dawood in his Risala to people of Ahl Makkah saying that nobody questioned the mursal hadith until Imam Shafi came along, right? Tabari saying the same thing. Nobody questioned it. Everybody was fine with it until. And so the essence of the mursal hadith is a loose, non-technical citing of information without sources. You're missing sources. Seerah is full of mursal hadiths, no chain transmission, right? Arabic poetry, it's all like that. Where's the chain transmission? Don't know, right? So you imagine if you're going to apply the standards of Bukhari and Muslim. So I'm only going to accept to put a word in the dictionary if I can prove that this word was used for this meaning with a chain transmission. You're not going to find it. Like, it's not going to work. The dictionaries that we use to understand Quran and Sunnah could not be built with that kind of mentality. If you said, I only accept facts that are sahih, sahih means it has a chain transmission. You're just not going to have anything. Does that make sense? Go ahead, Talib.
Just to make sure, Sheikh, each time you mentioned the word mursal, you were referring to a lacking isnad or no isnad at all, right?
It's the same. It's the same discussion.
Okay.
Because as soon as you accept one gap, you're accepting gaps in general. Right? It's the same thing. Okay? So now you're going to have these. Now when it comes to usul, Imam Shafi is going to come, and Imam Shafi says, I don't accept the mursal hadith. Why? Because the sahih hadith is like a shahada. Okay? So I bear witness, the Talib said, I bear witness that so-and-so said, that so-and-so said, that so-and-so said. So he said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given this thing called a shahada. And he has given us a structure of how shahada works. So Allah wants us, through revelation, Allah wants us to use the same system. The system of a shahada, of a witness in court, is the same thing with chain transmission. If you don't have a witness system of witnesses, so-and-so witnessed this, it doesn't count. Imam Shafi questions it. Again, why is Imam Shafi questioning it? Because the muhaddithin have seen mistakes happen with mursal hadiths. Okay, so it is not the point that a mursal hadith is wrong, is that certain mursal hadiths have been disproved by other information. Does that make sense? So it is the occurrence of inconsistencies that calls us to ask for a connected chain of transmission, not that we need a connected chain of transmission to begin with. Does that make sense? That's like saying I went to the doctor and the doctor told me to take this medication and I got really, really sick. I went to him again and he said, give me this medication. I got really, really, really sick. And then I realized the doctor doesn't know anything. And if I don't check what the doctor says against other information, I will continue to get sick. Right? So it is not that I need to check on the doctor to begin with. It is that I have found that my doctor continually makes mistakes when he doesn't check his medical journals, when he doesn't check with another doctor. And so now I have to check as an accident, as an extra step, that as a result of a problem that has occurred, not as a default thing. Does that make sense? So the default is you do not need isnad and you can accept a mursal hadith. Right? Imam Shafi comes along. Why does he say it? He says the muhaddithin have found errors as a circumstance of events and what's happened. I have also thought about it theoretically, and he said it doesn't make sense based on the system that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has accepted. Therefore, we're going to reject it. Go ahead, Farhan.
I didn't really understand what you meant because on the one hand you say the default is that we accept mursal hadith
Correct.
But on the other hand, you say that Imam al-Shafi did not accept Mursal Hadith because there were mistakes happening, even though that there are a lot of true Mursal Hadith. There might be a lot of true Mursal Hadith.
That is correct. So I'm saying Imam Shafi's approach is not the default approach. That's not the default.
Okay, so Imam Shafi just didn't take the default
He did
approach.
not. Yeah. So the default is that we accept a mursal hadith, just like the tabi'i accepts Ibn Abbas to narrate from the Prophet ﷺ, even though we don't know which Sahabi it was, because we trust him and because Ibn Abbas is not to know make mistakes. Similarly, I'm going to narrate from a student of Ibn Abbas who quotes the Prophet ﷺ, and I'm going to assume that the student of Ibn Abbas is quoting Ibn Abbas or somebody else, and I'm going to assume that whoever they are, they're trustworthy, and that's it. That's the default. Right? Now, what happens when I found inconsistencies? Okay? What happens when you find inconsistencies? Suddenly, I have heard many hadiths that this teacher, student of Ibn Abbas, have said, and they don't make sense. Or they're strange. Now I come up with a new criterion. I say, nope, I'm not going to accept it until you quote your source. Okay? So that means the default is I don't need a chain, and then I've only asked for a chain when errors have occurred. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And it's not the other way around. It's not that the default. So you will find in the scholars also, particularly the Shafi'is, they will try and make it a theoretical thing. Like it wouldn't la yufid al-dhann. It doesn't make you confident. It does make you confident. Right? It does make you confident. The issue is that there are errors. So what does that mean then? Is can we come along and say in an absolute sense, all mursal hadiths are fine? The answer is no. Can we come along then and say all mursal hadiths are not reliable? The answer is no. So in reality, what we need to do is, if you look at Imam Malik again, does Imam Malik accept all mursal hadiths? The answer is no. So he says here, وَمَذْهَبُ مَالِكٍ رَحِمَهُ اللَّهِ قَبُولَ الْخَبَرِ الْمُرْسَلِ يعني كل خبر مرسل كوفيا كان بصريا كان مدنيا مكيا, it doesn't matter what it is. إذا كان مرسله عدلا عارفا بما أرسل كما يقبل المسند. Right? So the way he phrases it is as a universal principle. Right? So Imam Malik would accept, for example, his teacher Zayd ibn Aslam narrating from the Prophet ﷺ, or narrating from Sayyidina Umar, apparently. Right? Which is true. And Imam Malik would also accept Yahya ibn Kathir, who was originally Basran, but later on he's in Damascus, narrating from the Prophet ﷺ. Is that really the case? The answer is it's not the case. So in reality, Imam Malik will accept certain mursal hadiths in certain places, and he will accept them if they agree with Amal al-Medina. So it is not true that Imam Malik will accept all mursal hadiths. Okay? Similarly, Imam Abu Hanifa will accept certain mursal hadiths, but he won't accept them in all of them because number one, he's going to subject them to more criterion. Imam Shafi'i, does Imam Shafi'i reject all mursal hadiths? No, he doesn't. He himself will say, I'll accept it if it's backed up by other evidence, such as majority of fuqaha are holding it, such as the fatwa of certain Sahaba. So Imam Shafi himself, he says, when I have other evidence to show that this is not a mistake, I'll go with it. Does that make sense? Right? And then similarly, when we get to the muhaddithin themselves, the muhaddithin, this is something we have to understand with the hadith, is hadith went through this process of becoming this very technical science with absolute rules. In reality, there aren't absolute rules because the muhaddithin are dealing with the problem and coming out of the problem. They're not dealing with a universal system. So they will say something like, yeah, if Imam Malik quotes it, we'll accept it. But if someone else does, we won't. So in reality, you will see that the muhaddithin, they're dealing with actual reality, like where has Imam Malik made mistakes? Where has so-and-so made mistakes? Where have we found that so-and-so quotes the Prophet ﷺ without without having contradictory evidence? When has that happened? So you'll see, for example, one of the hadithin, I can't remember now who it was. He said, I think it was Abu Hatim al-Razi, could be. He said, I've never found Hassan al-Basri, who is a tabi'i, quoting the Prophet ﷺ and then not finding similar kind of evidence elsewhere. So meaning, I don't find Hassan al-Basri quoting the Prophet ﷺ with random content that sounds off. Does that make sense? So therefore, Hassan al-Basri, yes. So-and-so else, no. So when we look at the world of the muhaddithin, it's actually very specific. It's not universal. Okay? So when we look at the world of Imam Malik is accepting certain mursal hadith with certain criterion from certain people, not just anything. It's not just a universal thing. Imam Shafi'i is rejecting certain mursal hadiths under certain criterion. It's not just anything. The muhaddithin themselves, they're not just rejecting, they don't treat everything the same way. Imam Ahmad was asked, what if Sa'id ibn Musayyib, right? Sa'id ibn Musayyib, who was the son-in-law of Abu Hurairah and a great, mufti of Medina. What if he quotes Sayyidina Umar and there's a gap in the chain? Do you accept it or do you not accept it? He says, yeah, I accept it. So, but that's a mursal, there's a gap in the chain. So yeah, but it's okay. Because of who Sa'id Musayyib is. Does that make sense? So the muhaddithin, that's why they will, for example, accept certain hadiths from certain weak narrators, but they won't accept certain other hadiths from certain strong narrators, because this content from this person in this time with this teacher is not acceptable, but this content from the other person from that person is acceptable, right? So they have more of a nuanced picture. It's not just yes or no. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. And if I just make a comparison, okay? Abdullah ibn Ukaym. Okay? Abdullah ibn Ukaym. Sorry, Sunabihi, for example. Sunabihi. Okay? So we read in the beginning of Tirmidhi, the first few pages of Tirmidhi, he talks about this individual called Sunabihi. He says, رحل النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وقبض النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وهو في الطريق وقد روى عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أحاديث. He says, this As-Sanabihi, he was traveling to the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, and the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم passed away 4 days before he reached there. Subhanallah, he missed seeing the Prophet ﷺ by 4 days. وقد روى عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أحاديث, but he's also narrated certain hadiths from the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. So that's going to be mursal, right? So this Sanabihi, he is a mukhadram, right? He became Muslim during the time of the Prophet, but he never visited the Prophet. So he comes and he's going to be in Medina, and who he's going to be narrating hadith from? From Sahaba, right? So do you care which Sahabi he's narrating from? No. So his hadith are mursal, correct. But why do you care then? Like, what's the difference between Sanabihi and Abdullah ibn Abbas? There's no difference. Oh, but one's a Sahabi, one's a Tabi'i. Yeah, but it's no difference. When you're dealing with probability, it's the same. It's no difference. Right? In rates a hadith, it's all the same. So now you label one as acceptable but not the other on a technicality. That's not very reasonable. And the muhaddithin, they're very reasonable. They're dealing with practical reality, not theory. Okay. Similarly, you're narrating a hadith from Ata ibn Abi Rabah, the great student of Ibn Abbas. And you know that Ata ibn Rabah narrates hadith from his own students. So you traveled from Central Asia all the way to Mecca, and Ata ibn Rabah quotes a hadith saying, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. When in reality, who said that? Your friend from Central Asia told him that. Your friend could have told you that hadith. So the hadith goes from Mecca back to Central Asia, from Central Asia somewhere into Baghdad, from Baghdad to Basra, from Basra to Baghdad, and it's like, come on, bro, there's going to be some errors here. So there's a big difference between who and what and how, right? There's a big difference. You can't just give a label, Mursal Hadiths in principle. It's not like that. Go ahead, Talib.
Just to clear up my doubts, the criticisms you've mentioned, are these just common notions of like nowadays, which occur nowadays, or are these criticisms of like classical understandings even?
Yeah, it's a criticism. It's not a criticism. I am trying to fill in the blanks of a very simple understanding. So even here, this sheikh, he mentions it in a general sense. Is it actually general? The answer is no. Right? It's not like that. So with Imam Shafi specifically, at least it's a bit more universal. In general, Imam Shafi says, I will reject a Mursal hadith like this, unless it has this. It is a bit more specific. But in general, the way that Imam Malik works with the Mursal hadith, it is not as he described. The way the Hanafis deal with it, it is not as he described. Mursal hadiths are not all the same. They vary drastically. So when you say, I accept it, you don't accept it, it's like saying, I don't believe in used cars. Is that fair to say? Like I've had enough of used cars. I'm only ever going to buy a new car. Is it true to say that all new cars are better than all used cars?
No.
It's not. So what if it just came out? Like you just drove it out of the showroom and then I bought it from you. There's no difference, right? There's no difference. It's the same car. In fact, the fact that you've used it for a day probably means that it works, right? It means that, so when you have these absolute, it's a criticism of the oversimplification of the discussion. Okay, it's an oversimplification of the discussion. Now, should we oversimplify certain discussions in order to make some principles? Yes. Okay, we have to do that, right? We have to say, sometimes you have to oversimplify to at least make some kind of principle. In principle, is it a proof or not? Right? Like we had that discussion of, is the amr for fawr or not? Right? If you remember that discussion, do you have to do it immediately or not? We said, in theory, the majority of scholars say no, and the Malikis say yes. In practice, it's much more complex because when you actually apply it, there are always qara'in that tell you yes or no. Okay, but it is useful to pinpoint in principle. Is it or is it not? Right? But my point is we need to understand, we need to kind of take the discussion apart. We have to understand that there's some certain oversimplifications which aren't super useful, or we have to see them in a more complex light. And B, this is another thing we have to understand, is that usul al-fiqh has been taken over, usul al-fiqh and hadith has been taken over by the mutakallimin. Okay, you have to understand that. So if you look at everything, like even Ibn Salah, right? Ibn Salah is like the beginning of the organized hadith world. Before that, it's more loose. Ibn Salah is more of a faqih than he is a muhaddith. So he's interested in systems. When you see Ibn Hajar is a huge hadith scholar, but the way he organizes Nuqt al-Fikr is like a kalami/usuli book. And it deals with they're trying to put things in big pictures, right? And so that's useful, but it's also not useful. Does that make sense? It's like somebody trying to categorize here is a successful marriage. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7's debated. 8. It's not like that, right? This is marriage. You can't really talk about it in that way. Or the exact integrals of good parenting. Like it's just not like that. You just have to leave it. It's nice to mention some things, but the rest of it is kind of loose, and that's just the nature of it. So the nature of hadith is it is loose and it is analysis of likelihoods based on specifics. And so when they try to move it from specifics to universals, you lose a lot of the art. Does that make sense? So when you find usuliyin talking about hadith, it's all off to begin with. Does that make sense? So someone like Imam Ghazali talking about a mursal hadith is just not particularly useful to begin with. Whereas somebody like Dhahabi is totally different. Right? Somebody like Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, totally different. That's the muhaddith world. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So that doesn't mean that we discount these people. It doesn't mean that at all. Right? I'm not trying to say that, but I'm saying that we have to see where this person's coming from. And then we flip the other side. I'm going to read Kitab al-Ilm in Ibn Majah. So what's more useful, Kitab al-Ilm in Ibn Majah or Imam Ghazali talking about ilm? Like Imam Ghazali or Imam Razi talking about knowledge. What is knowledge? What is dhan? What is waham? What are the sources of it? What is this? What is that? They're on another planet. Whereas someone like Ibn Majah is just very primitive. And it's kind of like, it's just, they don't really do a good job because that's just the nature of it because it's a hadith book. So you're talking about logic, you want to talk about knowledge, you're talking about qiyas. Okay, that's the world of the muhaddith, the usuliyin, right? That's the world of muhaddith. So we have to take every single ikhtisas, we have to take from the ikhtisas. So here we have a kind of gap, right? Which is a hadith discussion and usul discussion. It's somewhat not very useful, if that makes sense. And so I refer you again to that recording that I started. It's kind of beginning of the discussion in the Mursal Hadith that I shared last week, and also look at the beginning of the Marasil of Sunan of Abi Dawood, right? The Marasil of Abi Dawood with the introduction, lengthy introduction of Sheikh Shu'aib Arnaout, right? And you're going to see it's a very different kind of planet. And then it's also an objection of the mutaakhirin. So you find people like Sheikh Albani and others who are late scholars, not just Sheikh Albani himself, but they will apply certain universal principles which aren't really true, right? So for those of you, for example, who are familiar with hadith science, you say, for example, oh, this narrator is a saduq, therefore his hadith is hasan. Like this is a classic thing that you're going to see, which is just indicative of a universalizing something that's much more complex than that. Because in reality, we're interested in your tabaqa, where are you in the chain, who are you narrating, and what are you narrating. And so sometimes we might reject the hadith of a thiqah, and other times we might accept the hadith of somebody who's that's borderline, because depending on who you're narrating from, when are you narrating from, and what are you narrating. And so when you have these universal things, this hadith is hasan because Saduq narrated, this hadith is weak. It's an oversimplification, which is doesn't really reflect what the muhaddithin do. Okay? Just like, used cars are bad, right? That's an oversimplification. It's just not particularly useful because it's too simple. Okay? خير. And he says وقد احتج به في مواضع كثيرة حيث أرسل الخبر في اليمين مع الشاهد وعمل به وكذلك. So again, where's the problem in this istidlal? So he's saying Imam Malik treats a mursal hadith as a proof. How do I know that? He quotes a hadith and then applies it. You say, well, if the hadith was sahih and it went against Amal Ahmadina, would Imam Malik apply it? You say no. Okay, what if the hadith was weak and it conformed with Amal Ahmadina? Would Imam Malik apply it? Say yes. Okay, so there we go. So you're conflating two things. You're conflating a hadith being a proof in and of itself versus a hadith being a part of an argument. Okay, so it would be very difficult to say that Imam Malik unconditionally accepts mursal hadiths, such that I can find a mursal hadith that is not in Medina and does not confirm with Amal Ahmadina, and then apply it as the Maliki school. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Right. And make a further point. Is it easy? Now, given, for example, in the Maliki school, given that in the Maliki school they have approximately 17 adillah, right? Ijmaliyah. Right? In the Shafi school we have 4. So in reality, it's actually very, very difficult to do what's called takhrij, to add a qawl to the Maliki school and say this is the Maliki school. The Shafi school is the clearest school, just historically speaking, in terms of usul and in terms of furu'. So we have extensive furu' from Imam Shafi'i. We have extensive books from Imam Shafi'i, and we know how he works. So we know what he said, we know what he didn't say, we know how he works. So it's actually easier to agree or disagree with Imam Shafi'i. And that's why you find, so many mujtahid imams within the Shafi school, because it's actually easier to agree or disagree. It's like it's a kind of a simpler process, right? It's like I'm showing you my working. You can look at my maths, and does it make sense what I did or not? And could you change it? My math looks great, but I changed a 3 into a 4, and so you just change the number here, which changes the answer, but it's still my answer. But if you don't know what I'm doing and my system is extremely complex, it's very, very hard to correct me or to disagree with me because you don't really know what I'm doing. So the Shafi'i school is the easiest school to agree or disagree with, where the other schools is a bit vague. So same thing here. It's quite complex what Imam Malik is doing. So it's quite difficult to come and look what he did and then extrapolate a universal principle. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, وكذلك even in the Hanafi school, like do you find a situation in the Hanafi school where there is a mursal hadith that it clearly Imam Abu Hanifa didn't know, and had he known it, he would have acted upon it, and then the Hanafis found it and then acted upon it, and then ascribed it to Imam Abu Hanifa as his madhab? Like, I think that's quite difficult. It's quite difficult, like to look at it in that way. Whereas in the Shafi school, that happens. Right, the Shafi school, you'll see scenarios where here's a hadith that is sahih. We know that we know how Imam Shafi would look at this hadith, and we know that he didn't know this hadith, and we are able now to put it into his mouth. Like, we can now say this is the Shafi school, even though Imam Shafi didn't say it. Right, it's much harder in the other schools. Hanbali school as well. Right, we don't do we know everything that Imam Malik Ahmad knew? Not really. Right. The way that fiqh has reached us is not the same. The way that usul, how does he work with weak hadiths, is not as simple as you could imagine, right? He will, sometimes there's scenarios where it goes against sahih hadith, right? For various reasons. It says, وَكَذَلِكَ أَرْسَلَ الْحَدِيث فِي الشُّفْعَةِ لِلشَّرِيكِ وَعَمِلَ بِهِ إلى آخره. وكذلك أرسل الخبر في ناقة البراء وسائر جنايات المواشي وعمل بها. والحجة له أن المرسل إذا كان عدلا متيقظا فقد أسقط عنا بعدالته وتيقظه تعديل من لم يذكره لنا ممن روى عنه. Right? So he's saying basically, assuming you are reliable and assuming you are mutayaqiz, like you know who to narrate from, then I should be able to trust you. What is your argument against that? Aryas, for example, I leave my son Mikal with Aryas. I say, Aryas, Mikal, you're going to stay with Uncle Aryas. Aryas, please look after him. Aryas hands him to, who else is here in the classroom? To Talib. Okay? 2 weeks later, I'm like, Aryas, I'm safe now. Where's my son? He's like, I gave him to Talib. And I'm like, Habibi, please don't do that. Why? I trust you, but I don't trust the people that you trust. Does that make sense? So Aryas trusted Talib. I don't trust Talib. So I trust Aryas, but I don't necessarily trust the people that Aryas trusts. He's made a judgment about Talib. I disagree with the judgment, right? Just a joke. I'm just giving an example, Talib, right? I'm not saying anything about you, right? So this happens in real life, right? We do this in real life. You trust somebody. That doesn't mean you trust the person that they trust, right? So it's not just mutlaq at-tayaqqud. It's not just being careful in general, right? It doesn't work like that. So the proof for them to say we don't accept a mursal hadith is, I don't know what your sources is. We don't necessarily agree on people, right? Imam Malik himself. Imam Malik will narrate hadith from, what's his name? Abdul Karim ibn al-Makharib. And people like, subhanallah, why did Imam Malik narrate from him? So Imam Malik wasn't aware and didn't know that he was weak. Right? So maybe I shouldn't accept the mursal hadith of Malik. So just because I trust you doesn't mean I trust the people you trust from. That's the argument they're using. So, and again, they're working in a system of assuming errors, assuming there's an error going to happen, and because errors have happened, so now they're going to assume they make these errors. Is that fair to assume that there's going to be an error? Is it fair to assume that every single time Imam Malik doesn't quote his source, that it's narrating from this particular person that I don't trust? Is that really fair to say? Allahu Alam. Right? فوجب لمن وجب تقليده في عدالته أن يقلده في أنه لا يروي عن غير عدل ثقة. Really? So just because I follow you, that doesn't mean I follow the people you'd trust. So that's their approach. So the approach of the Hanafis and the general approach of the Hanafis and the general argument of Malikis is if you trust somebody, you trust the person that they trust. Is that actually the case? Allahu Alam. وقد علم أنه إذا صرح بذكر من روى عنه فقد وكل الاجتهاد إلينا. Right? So so the author is saying, well, I say, Arias, is it raining? He says, I don't know, but Talib says it's raining. So what does that mean? That means I personally don't know whether it's raining or not. And Talib says it's raining. You, Farid, judge whether you should trust Talib or not. As opposed to when I say Arias, is it raining? He says, yeah, that means it's raining. If I trust Arias, then I trust his sources, right? So they're trying to say is that when you quote the source, you're only quoting the source so as to make the other person make the decision whether they should trust you or not. Does that make sense? So it's almost like quoting the sources is an implicit way of saying, this is doubtful and I don't know if it's correct or not, but hey, my source says it is. Does that make sense? So that's like saying, somebody says, hey, should you move to Malaysia? Be like, yeah, I can't say that, but my friend said it's a good idea. Right? So the fact that I'm mentioning my friend is actually indicative of the fact that I'm doubting about it. But if I don't quote my source, it is indicative of the fact that it's a well-known, established fact, and so therefore you should trust it. Hassan al-Basri is quoted to have said this, that he said, when I don't quote my source, that's because I heard it from many people. When I do quote my source, it's because it's from one person. Ibrahim al-Nakhai as well. He said, when I don't quote my source, and I'm quoting Abdullah Mas'ud, when I say Abdullah Mas'ud said, that means I heard it from many people. But when I do quote my source, it means I only heard it from one person. Right? So that means if Ibrahim al-Nakhai says, Abdullah Mas'ud said, and doesn't quote the source, you should have more trust in it than when he does quote the source. So therefore, you should trust a mursal hadith more than a musnad hadith, because a musnad hadith is phrased in a way where the narrator is giving doubt and saying this is not sure, but hey, it's up to you. You can trust it or not. Does that make sense?
Yes.
وأنه إذا أضرب عن ذكره فقد استبد بعلم ما خفي علينا من عدالته. Right? He says, as for when he doesn't mention it, he's saying, don't worry about it, it's fine. Right? Right? Now, again, this is the world of not really the world of muhaddithin. Right? That's an exception to the rule. Right? That's an exception to the rule that sometimes you might find in certain cases that's the case, but it's not always the case. Right? So in reality, what you need to know is how often does it happen that Imam Malik quotes the Prophet ﷺ or quotes somebody who's quoting the Prophet ﷺ without a source, and then you find contradictory evidence? Did that happen? No. Okay, therefore you can trust Imam Malik or trust his sources or his sources, even if they don't quote their sources back to the Prophet ﷺ. Whereas when you do quote a hadith that, for example, might have contradictory evidence that might sound strange or might be odd, you should quote the source because it sounds odd and there's kind of evidence going against it. And you need to give me more surety. Wallahu alam. He says, وَلَنْ يَعْمَلَ مَعَلَى ذَلِكَ مَنْ كَانَ مَرْضِيًّا عِنْدَنَا ضَابِطًا مُخْتَيَقِظًا إِلَّا وَقَدْ بَالَغَ فِي الثِّقَةِ مِمَّنْ رَوَى عَنْهُ. He said, nobody would ever narrate a hadith from somebody that he doesn't trust. Right? Nobody would ever narrate a hadith from somebody who doesn't trust or apply it. Right? In reality, people do that. That does happen. People narrate hadiths from people they don't trust. And they tell you, so-and-so told me. Right? So people in reality will narrate, Sahaba and Tabi'een, or not Tabi'een or Tabi'een will narrate from people who they don't trust. They say, I don't advise you to narrate from so-and-so, and then they narrate from him. Right? So that's not actually true either. ولن يقول قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إلا من حيث يصح عنده أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قاله. So he's saying nobody would ever quote a hadith unless they believe the hadith is sahih. Is that true? No. Well, but his argument is yes, right? And so in reality, what if the person was telling you the hadith and the way that he quotes hadiths is he never quotes hadiths unless he thinks they're true, like Imam Malik. So Imam Malik won't quote hadiths that he believes are weak, whereas many people will narrate hadiths that people are weak, right? So in reality, is it absolutely the case that it's acceptable, or is it conditioned upon who the person is, etc.? And what kind of hadiths have you heard from them in the past? ولم يزل أصحاب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يوصلون ويخبرون بعضهم بعضا. That's true. فيذكرون من أخبرهم تارة ويستغنون عن ذكره أخرى. Fine. وكذلك التابعون بعدهم وتابعوهم فدل على صحة ما قلناه وأنه إجماع من الفقهاء والمحدثون يستعملونه في كل عصر وزمان فوجب أنه جهة معمول بها. I'm not sure why he says به. والله أعلم. Right? He's saying this is how things are. End of story. Okay? So in reality, certain points that he's made are not absolutely true, but they can be true. Right? And so in reality, we have to judge the mursal hadith case by case, point by point. That's why in reality, Imam Shafi'i does act upon certain mursal hadiths. Right? He does do that. Right? He doesn't reject it absolutely. Right? Nor does Imam Malik and Imam Abu Hanifa absolutely accept mursal hadiths. Right? Similarly, Imam Ahmad, he will use a mursal hadith, but he also uses a weak hadith. So that doesn't mean that much. Right? So to treat it in an absolute sense, it is not, right? It is not 100% sound, right? As opposed to you can say in an absolute sense, right? In an absolute sense, everybody agrees that if there was a sahih hadith, meaning so-and-so narrates from so-and-so from so-and-so, and there was no other evidence for or against it, right? So even with a sahih hadith, obviously that it's a bit more complex. But in principle, a sahih hadith is a dalil. That makes sense, right? In principle, so we're talking about going back to this. Let's simplify it again. There is you, and there is a prophet who just passed away. Okay? And there's 2 generations between you and that prophet, and there was one command, right? So let's make it really simple and really abstract. Okay? There was a prophet who passed away. There was a generation that heard him speak and etc. And then you're narrating from the next generation. And there's just one command. The command is leave Germany and move to Austria. That was one command. If it was mursal, would you be obliged to accept it, follow it, or not? Right? So let's take it out of, there's no other command. There's no other evidence for and against. There's nothing else. There's just one command, and that's it. So we would all agree that if the chain was connected, right? If it was so-and-so said, and he was trustworthy, who said that this person who was an eyewitness account of this prophet said, move out of Austria and go to Germany, that you would be obliged to do it because you feed Allah, right? Now, what if it contradicts other information? That's something else. But in itself, that's fine. When it comes to the mursal hadith, though, what if this person said, I didn't hear or see this prophet, but somebody narrated to me that he said these words. And you don't know if that person that he's mentioning is an eyewitness account or not, or if they're reliable or not. Is that a proof or is that not a proof? In principle, Imam Shafi is saying no. And in principle, the others are saying yes. But in reality, that doesn't exist. In reality, nothing exists in a vacuum. It's always with supporting evidence or evidence that goes against it. Does that make sense? And sometimes it's more complex than elsewhere. So I mentioned for the Maliki school, for the Shafi'i school, sorry, for the other three madhahib in general, their madhahib is sufficiently complex. It's quite difficult to get one absolute system for that particular issue. You know, if you ask Imam Malik, Imam Ahmad, let's assume you're on Mars and there was a prophet from another planet and there was one command and it reached you as a mursal hadith, would you apply it or would you not? The default, as we know from the Malik Hanbali school, is yes, you would, because you know the default is you'd act upon a hadith like that. And the default in the Shafi school is you wouldn't, because it's not supported by other evidence, it's not the widespread this, not that, etc. But in reality, things are never that simple. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, but I can't emphasize enough the importance to go back to the source for hadith, the hadith world, right? So two things with the hadith world. A, there is a difference, a slight difference between the mutaakhirin and mutaqaddimin, okay? And Sheikh Albani, half of his problem is not him. Half of his problem is he's just applying the mutaakhirin, okay? There's he has fiqh issues and aqeedah issues. I'm talking about in hadith itself. Half of Sheikh Albani rahimahullah's problem is not him. Half of his problem is that he's just applying the mutaakhirin. Okay? That's half of his problem. That's A. B, the usuliyin and mutakallimin, they try and systematize things and put things as universal principles, but that really is not very useful when it deals with the world of hadith. So therefore, for the hadith, we have to go back to the muhaddithin. And in reality, it's a different picture, totally. The mursal hadith is a very good example of that. And other things as well. The weak hadith. What does a weak hadith even mean? Right? Right? What does that even mean? So we mentioned, I believe, last week. Oh no, there was another class, right? Translating from weak, that was in the mursal class, translating from proof, when that muhaddithin says laysa bi hujjah, he's not a hujjah, and when we say hujjah, do they mean the same thing? Right? These are two different worlds, and it's very, when you're dealing with these two different worlds of you feed a dhan or it's sahih, it's not really the same thing. You feed a dhan is one thing and sahih is something else, right? Hence the maratib as-sihha, right? Like the different levels of how sahih something is. Right? So inshallah, next week we'll talk about Amal Ahl Medina, inshallah ta'ala. And perhaps if somebody could research what Ibn Taymiyyah said about Amal Ahl Medina, inshallah ta'ala. And somebody can also think about Amal Ahl Kufa, right? If you think about that as well, inshallah, we can talk about it, inshallah, next week, inshallah. So let me just see. Let's stop the recording.